Military Executions by Ambrose Bierce. In the spring of the year 1862, General Buell's big army lay in camp, licking itself into shape for the campaign which resulted in the victory at Shiloh. It was a raw, untrained army, although some of its fractions had seen hard enough service with a good deal of fighting in the mountains of western Virginia and in Kentucky. The war was young and soldiering a new industry, imperfectly understood by the young American of the period, who found some features of it not altogether to his liking. Chief among these was the essential part of discipline, subordination. To one imbued from infancy with the fascinating fallacy that all men are born equal, unquestioning submission to authority is not easily mastered, and the American volunteer soldier, in his green and salad days, is among the worst known. This is how it happened that one of Buell's men, Private Bennett Story Green, committed the indiscretion of striking his officer. Later in the war he would have not done that. Like Sir Andrew Aguecheek, he would have seen him damned first. But time for reformation of his military manners was denied him. He was promptly arrested on complaint of the officer, tried by court-martial, and sentenced to be shot. "You might have thrashed me and let it go at that," said the condemned man to the complaining witness. "That is what you used to do at school, when you were playing Will Dudley, and I was just as good as you. Nobody saw me strike you. Discipline would not have suffered much." "Ben Green, I guess you were right about that," said the lieutenant. "Will you forgive me? That is what I came to see you about." There was no reply, and an officer putting his head in at the door of the guard tent where the conversation had occurred explained that the time allowed for the interview had expired. The next morning, when in the presence of the whole brigade, Private Green was shot to death by a squad of his comrades. Lieutenant Dudley turned his back upon the sorry performance and muttered a prayer for mercy, in which himself was included. A few weeks afterward, as Buell's leading division was being ferried over the Tennessee River to assist in succoring Grant's beaten army, night was coming on, black and stormy. Through the wreck of the battle, the division moved, inch by inch, in the direction of the enemy, who had withdrawn a little to reform his lines. But for the lightning, the darkness was absolute. Never for a moment did it cease, and ever when the thunder did not crack and roar, were heard the moans of the wounded, among whom the men felt their way with their feet, and upon whom they stumbled in the gloom. The dead were there too. There were dead aplenty. In the first faint gray of the morning, when the swarming advance had paused to resume something of definition as a line of battle, and skirmishers had been thrown forward, word was passed along to call the roll. The first sergeant of Lieutenant Dudley's company stepped to the front and began to name the men in alphabetical order. He had no written roll, but a good memory. The men answered to their names as he ran down the alphabet to G. "Gorham! Here. Grayrock! Here." The sergeant's good memory was affected by habit. "Green! Here." The response was clear, distinct, unmistakable. A sudden movement and agitation of the entire company front, as from an electric shock, attested the startling character of the incident. The sergeant paled and paused. The captain strode quickly to his side and said sharply, "Call that name again." Apparently, the Society for Psychical Research is not first in the field of curiosity concerning the unknown. "Bennett Green! Here." All faces turned in the direction of the familiar voice. The two men between whom, in the order of stature, Green had commonly stood in line, turned and squarely confronted each other. "Once more!" commanded the inexorable investigator, and once more came, a trifle tremulously, the name of the dead man. "Bennett Story Green? Here." At that instant, a single rifle shot was heard. Away to the front, beyond the skirmish line, followed, almost attended by the savage hiss of an approaching bullet, which, passing through the line, struck audibly, punctuating, as with a full stop, the captain's exclamation. "What the devil does it mean?" Lieutenant Dudley pushed through the ranks from his place in the rear. "It means this," he said, throwing open his coat and displaying a visibly broadening stain of crimson on his breast. His knees gave way. He fell awkwardly and lay dead. A little later, the regiment was out of line to relieve the congested front, and through some misplay in the game of battles was not again under fire. Nor did Bennett Green, expert in military executions, ever again signify his presence at one. Present at a Hanging by Ambrose Bierce. An old man named Daniel Baker, living near Lebanon, Iowa, was suspected by his neighbors of having murdered a peddler who had obtained permission to pass the night at his house. This was in 1853, when peddling was more common in the western country than it is now, and was attended with considerable danger. The peddler, with his pack, traversed the country by all manner of lonely roads, and was compelled to rely upon the people for hospitality. This brought him into relation with queer characters, some of whom were not altogether scrupulous in their methods of making a living, murder being more acceptable means to that end. It occasionally occurred that a peddler with diminished pack and swollen purse would be traced to the lonely dwelling of some rough character, and never could be traced beyond. This was so in the case of Old Man Baker, as he was always called. Such names are given in the western settlements only to elderly persons who are not esteemed. To the general disrepute of social unworth is affixed the special reproach of age. A peddler came to his house, and none went away. That is all anybody knew. 7 years later, the Reverend Mr. Cummings, a Baptist minister well known in that part of the country, was driving by Baker's farm one night. It was not very dark. There was a bit of moon somewhere above the light-veiled mist that lay along the earth. Mr. Cummings, who was at all times a cheerful person, was whistling a tune, which he would occasionally interrupt to speak a word of friendly encouragement to his horse. As he came to a little bridge across a dry ravine, he saw the figure of a man standing upon it, clearly outlined against the gray background of a misty forest. The man had something strapped on his back and carried a heavy stick. Obviously an itinerant peddler, his attitude had in it a suggestion of abstraction, like that of a sleepwalker. Mr. Cummings reined in his horse when he arrived in front of him, gave him a pleasant salutation, and invited him into a seat in the vehicle. "If you're going my way," he added. The man raised his head, looked him full in the face, but neither answered nor made any further movement. The minister, with good-natured persistence, repeated his invitation. At this, the man threw his right hand forward from his side and pointed downward as he stood on the extreme edge of the bridge. Mr. Cummings looked past him, over into the ravine, saw nothing unusual, and withdrew his eyes to address the man again. He had disappeared. The horse, which all this time had been uncommonly restless, gave at the same moment a snort of terror and started to run away. Before he had regained control of the animal, the minister was at the crest of the hill, 100 yards along. He looked back and saw the figure again, at the same place and in the same attitude as when he had been first observed. Then, for the first time, he was conscious of a sense of the supernatural, and drove home as rapidly as his willing horse would go. On arriving at home, he related his adventure to his family, and early the next morning, accompanied by two neighbors, John White Corwell and Abner Razor, returned to the spot. They found the body of Old Man Baker hanging by the neck from one of the beams of the bridge, immediately beneath the spot where the apparition had stood. A thick coating of dust, slightly dampened by the mist, covered the floor of the bridge, but the only footprints were those of Mr. Cummings' horse. In taking down the body, the men disturbed the loose, friable earth of the slope below it, disclosing human bones already nearly uncovered by the action of water and frost. They were identified as those of the lost peddler. At the double inquest, the coroner's jury found that Daniel Baker died by his own hand while suffering from temporary insanity, and that Samuel Moritz was murdered by some person or persons to the jury unknown.
A Diagnosis of Death by Ambrose Bierce. I am not so superstitious as some of your physicians, men of science, as you are pleased to be called, said Halver, replying to an accusation that had not been made. Some of you, only a few, I confess, believe in the immortality of the soul, and in apparitions which you have not the honesty to call ghosts. I go no further than a conviction that the living are sometimes seen where they are not, but have been, where they have lived so long, perhaps so intensely, as to have left their impress on everything about them. I know indeed that one's environment may be so affected by one's personality as to yield, long afterward, an image of oneself to the eyes of another. Doubtless, the impressing personality has to be the right kind of personality, as the perceiving eyes have to be the right kind of eyes. Mine, for example. Yes, the right kind of eyes, conveying sensations to the wrong kind of brain, said Dr. Fraley, smiling. Thank you. One likes to have an expectation gratified. That is about the reply that I supposed you would have the civility to make. Pardon me, but you say that you know. That is a good deal to say, don't you think? Perhaps you will not mind the trouble of saying how you learned. You will call it an hallucination, Halver said, but that does not matter. And he told the story. Last summer I went, as you know, to pass the hot weather term in the town of Meridian. The relative at whose house I had intended to stay was ill, so I sought other quarters. After some difficulty, I succeeded in renting a vacant dwelling that had been occupied by an eccentric doctor of the name of Mannering, who had gone away years before. No one knew where, not even his agent. He had built the house himself and had lived in it with an old servant for about 10 years. His practice, never very extensive, had after a few years been given up entirely. Not only so, but he had withdrawn himself almost altogether from social life and become a recluse. I was told by the village doctor, about the only person with whom he held any relations, that during his retirement he had devoted himself to a single line of study, the result of which he had expounded in a book that did not commend itself to the approval of his professional brethren, who indeed considered him not entirely sane. I have not seen the book and cannot now recall the title of it, but I am told that it expounded a rather startling theory. He held that it was possible in the case of many a person in good health to forecast his death with precision, several months in advance of the event. The limit, I think, was 18 months. There were local tales of his having exerted his powers of prognosis, or perhaps you would say diagnosis, and it was said that in every instance the person whose friends he had warned had died suddenly at the appointed time, and from no assignable cause. All this, however, has nothing to do with what I have to tell. I thought it might amuse a physician. The house was furnished just as he had lived in it. It was a rather gloomy dwelling for one who was neither a recluse nor a student, and I think it gave something of its character to me, perhaps some of its former occupants' character, for always I felt in it a certain melancholy that was not in my natural disposition, nor, I think, due to loneliness. I had no servants that slept in the house, but I have always been, as you know, rather fond of my own society, being much addicted to reading, though little to study. Whatever was the cause, the effect was dejection and a sense of impending evil. This was especially so in Dr. Mannering's study, although that room was the lightest and most airy in the house. The doctor's life-size portrait in oil hung in that room, and seemed completely to dominate it. There was nothing unusual in the picture. The man was evidently rather good-looking, about 50 years old, with iron-gray hair, a smooth-shaven face and dark, serious eyes. Something in the picture always drew and held my attention. The man's appearance became familiar to me, and rather haunted me. One evening I was passing through this room to my bedroom with a lamp. There is no gas in Meridian. I stopped as usual before the portrait, which seemed in the lamplight to have a new expression not easily named, but distinctly uncanny. It interested, but did not disturb me. I moved the lamp from one side to the other, and observed the effects of the altered light. While so engaged, I felt an impulse to turn round. As I did so, I saw a man moving across the room directly toward me. As soon as he came near enough for the lamplight to illuminate the face, I saw that it was Dr. Mannering himself. It was as if the portrait were walking. "I beg your pardon," I said, somewhat coldly, "but if you knocked, I did not hear." He passed me within an arm's length, lifted his right forefinger, as in warning, and without a word went on out of the room, though I observed his exit no more than I had observed his entrance. Of course, I need not tell you that this was what you will call an hallucination, and I call an apparition. That room had only 2 doors, of which one was locked. The other led into a bedroom, from which there was no exit. My feeling on realizing this is not an important part of the incident. Doubtless, this seems to you a very commonplace ghost story, one constructed on the regular lines laid down by the old masters of the art. If that were so, I should not have related it, even if it were true. The man was not dead. I met him today in Union Street. He passed me in a crowd. Halver had finished his story, and both men were silent. Dr. Fraley absently drummed on the table with his fingers. "Did he say anything today?" he asked. "Anything from which you inferred that he was not dead?" Halver stared and did not reply. "Perhaps," continued Fraley, "he made a sign, a gesture, lifted a finger, as in warning. It's a trick he had, a habit when saying something serious, announcing the result of a diagnosis, for example. Yes, he did, just as his apparition had done. But good God, did you ever know him?" Halver was apparently growing nervous. "I knew him. I have read his book, as will every physician someday. It is one of the most striking and important of the century's contributions to medical science. Yes, I knew him. I attended him in an illness 3 years ago. He died." Halver sprang from his chair, manifestly disturbed. He strode forward and back across the room, then approached his friend, and in a voice not altogether steady, said, "Doctor, have you anything to say to me, as a physician?" "No, Halver, you are the healthiest man I ever knew. As a friend, I advise you to go to your room. You play the violin like an angel. Play it. Play something light and lively. Get this cursed bad business off your mind." The next day, Halver was found dead in his room, the violin at his neck, the bow upon the strings. His music opened before him at Chopin's funeral march.